One of the must-stop sites of anyone who tours Europe who loves the Reformation is Geneva. By the beautiful lake at the foot of the city, we see a place of not only wonderful beauty from the past, but a place where you need to take a boat ride. When you walk up from the lake along a steep cobblestone road, you come up to a place where you'll find a well, the very well where Calvin used to come and get his water. And right near there, there's Calvin Street.
And this is the Rue Jean Calvin. This is John Calvin's road, and we are standing right in front of the place where his house used to be. And he lived here for a 20-year period just before his death, those last 20 years before his death. And after he died, this building, there's a plaque up here which says that in 1706, actually the building was destroyed and a new building was built by a banker, the banker called Monsieur Lulin. And so that's the building we're actually seeing here. So you cannot go into Calvin's actual house. That is no longer in existence.
And you see the place where Calvin used to walk each day to the great Saint-Pierre Cathedral when he went to teach there, or to the Auditoire where John Knox taught and where Calvin would lecture sometimes. We know that Calvin loved the city of Geneva because it began to be a place of beauty for his family and for himself. When you go into his home, you walk into a historic building and there's still an area where you can imagine his garden was. And from that place, in an earlier time, he was able to sit down and look out over beautiful Lake Geneva.
We're actually standing in Calvin's garden. So right behind us is Calvin's, at least the place where his home used to be. Now it was a house built by Lulin in 1706, but this is where the home would have been. And this is the garden that John Calvin saw from his office and Idelette saw every day as they walked out. They probably ate out here also. Things have changed though over 500 years. In the descriptions, for example by Doumergue, the descriptions are very clear that from this garden, Calvin on the left could see the Jura Mountains. There are lower hilly mountains here in France, of course. And then to the right, he could see the Alps, and there's a snow-capped Mont Blanc that you could potentially see from here. And then straight ahead is the sprawling Lake Geneva, Lac Léman, largest lake in Europe. And so in Calvin's day, he could see the Jura, the lake, and the Alps. Well, today, there is no such thing. Not only do we have full trees here and hedges, but then we have all these buildings built now several stories high so that there's zero view. But this is really kind of a fun location to be at. I'm sure he came out here many times, got inspired, listened to the birds or whatever, and was able to look down upon what they called then a sprawling city of Geneva. There's only 10,000 people. Today it's 400,000 people. So kind of an interesting and cool place to be at.
As you walk down the road from Calvin's house to the beautiful Saint-Pierre Cathedral, we recognize that it has been impacted by later architectural developments. The columns that are in front of the church were there to help support it, but they were put up at a later time. They were not part of the original architecture.
The big pillars are quite a recent addition. They were an 18th century addition, which is recent in the history of this building. They were actually to hold the building together and to stop it falling down because the hill on which it is placed is not very stable. It's stable now because it has been drained, but in the old days the water table kept moving up and down and the building would move.
If you go into the under part of the Saint-Pierre Cathedral, excavations have been done and you can see that they were celebrating the Christian faith going back for centuries before Calvin ever appeared on that site.
The original site was a pagan site, a pagan Celtic site. It then became a Roman site, obviously, or there was a Roman building bigger than the cathedral now is, and it has been rebuilt totally or partially 200 times.
And as you go into the church, you see that it carries some of the beautiful Gothic features of the churches of medieval Europe. And as you walk in the middle, you begin to see to the left of the wonderful place where Calvin used to preach. There in that pulpit on the side, we find a wonderful soundboard at the top to help reflect the message of the voice to those that would listen. It wasn't a central pulpit because the best place to preach in a large building with all of its acoustical problems was right there.
If you do not have a microphone, the second pillar, and preaching straight across, is the way in which the greatest number of people can hear you in this building.
And with the sheer force of his convictions, he backed off.
Calvin bled from his throat when he preached here. I can well believe it. It is a horrible building to preach in. The acoustics are dreadful.
And then as you look forward, you can see where there once was an altar where the Mass was performed.
He modified this place by removing musical instruments. He removed pictures of the deity, removed crosses, and he turned it from a place where there was an altar with sacrifices to a place of preaching and teaching, and replaced an altar with a table where God's people could come and be fed by the gospel in bread and wine.
The Jubei was torn down and now became a large chancel area. We can see a chair that allegedly Calvin used to sit in. That's part of that. We can see the plaques that mark the history of the Reformation. It's a very simple looking building today. Probably in the medieval tradition it was painted and had all sorts of ornamentation. But those kind of issues were unimportant to the plain and austere Reformed worship that did not want to have the temptation for idolatry and iconic symbols within the worship place of God.
The Genevan Reformation, they did not smash a great deal. In fact, being Genevans, they put a great deal away, just in case the population changed again, and they put it in the roof space of the cathedral. There's a huge roof space up there. And the building was struck by lightning and there was a fire. And a lot of it was burnt. And of course, there were a lot of people saying, God got rid of it when they should have got rid of it for themselves. You know, statues of saints and things.
When you move out from this beautiful cathedral and you walk through the ancient streets of Geneva, you can see other beautiful places, like where the historic city government is found. You can see the places where shops and stores have been going on for centuries. And you can also look up and see the beautiful steeple of the cathedral. When you go up to the top and you look out, you see the vantage point of how beautifully situated Geneva is in all directions. As you look at the historic city, the beautiful lake, and the other great buildings that have been built out far beyond the ancient city into the countryside. Now, as you continue to walk around Geneva, you not only see the place where Calvin started a school for children, you see the Collège de Calvin, the College of Calvin, where students were taught. And you also find on the other side of town, the Green, where the Reformation Wall is.
It's a 100-meter leftover section of the Geneva Wall since Geneva had been a walled city. And on that, in 1909, they built the famous Reformation Wall. And the point of that wall is, of course, to commemorate Calvin and the major reformers. And there's 8 fresques or 8 murals, and these murals are different countries of the world, and it shows the influence of Calvinism in the world as they're depicted on those 8 murals.
Right across the Green from the Reformation Wall is the University of Geneva.
The building is not the one that Calvin would have known, but the university goes back to 1559, founded by Calvin, and its first president was Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's successor and biographer and a great statesman.
A school that was started under Calvin and Beza's influence that trained theologians that went all across Europe, many of whom went to be martyrs in France as they sought to advance the new Reformed faith under the persecution of the Roman Catholic king, who did not want another faith than his own in his kingdom. We can also see other sites in Geneva that are historic and significant. Perhaps one of the most painful is the site that is remembered where an anti-Trinitarian by the name of Miguel Servetus was burned at the stake.
My name is Sergio Baches, and I'm the director of the Michael Servetus Institute in Spain. The institute is located in the birthhouse of Michael Servetus in the little town of Villanueva de Sigena.
He was a medical doctor who had been influenced by some of the anti-Trinitarian thought coming from the Italian Reformation that was very radical in some senses, where they threw out Nicene theology. And Servetus began to teach the view that Jesus was not the eternal Son of God. He began to write books on this theme. He began to be a marked man all across Europe, whether in Lutheran lands, Roman Catholic lands, or Reformed lands. He was someone who was under the possibility of capital punishment for breaking the law by teaching an anti-Trinitarian theology. Well, he took the risk to come to Geneva.
There's probably indications that Servetus had some sort of eschatological quirk in which he believed that they were living in the end of time, and he had to have a showdown, a theological showdown with Calvin, and he believed that he in some way was God's emissary in that showdown.
He came to Geneva and he was discovered, and he was in fact tried. Now, the thesis that is often heard is that Calvin was the one that put him to death, but it's more complex than that.
And though, Servetus' death is tragic in a way, you got to remember that it was a city hall decision. It was a city's decision to burn him at the stake for heresy. Calvin had tried to go and plead with Servetus to change his mind. And Calvin actually pleaded for a lighter sentence than Servetus.
Calvin wanted him to be beheaded, a much more humane way of dying, but they insisted that he be burned at the stake. And so Servetus was burned at the stake. As we look back from this vantage point in time, we can see that as one of the tragic expressions of the Reformation.
Indeed, I would say that Servetus' ethical example and Servetus' death was like a spark that produced a really heated debate on freedom of conscience. And there were several philosophers and reformers, curiously, some of them coming from the north of Italy, who openly and sometimes harshly criticized Calvin for instigating the death of Servetus. And that was something which probably was unseen in the previous years.
They hadn't learned the great principle of religious liberty, the ability to say, you can be wrong about theological issues and still have civil rights. Someone has put it, you have the right to be wrong. Well, Presbyterians and Reformed people in America have appreciated the First Amendment and have supported it and adopted it into their theological perspective. It wasn't known then, but it was this kind of struggle that helped to create the question, how can you have a pluralistic society that still has a united civil government? This was a problem later that the Huguenots in France would wrestle with. They wrestled with that when William Penn came to Saumur, and he studied under Moses Amyot, and he saw for the first time under Henry IV, a Protestant king who became a Catholic king, to unite the French kingdoms into one. Basically what happened is that Henry IV realized that these wars of religion seen in Coligny and the Bartholomew Day massacre needed to end, but he didn't know how to end it. And so he literally converted to Catholicism and said, I'm going to become a Catholic to unite France, and in the process reached out to his former Protestant or Huguenot or French Reformed friends, and he tried to unite the country. The Edict of Nantes was his promise that he was going to give religious liberty to the Huguenots, as well as protect the Roman Catholics. And for the first time in history, a king allowed a contrary religion to his own to be freely protected and supported by his own resources. William Penn saw that, and that idea that worked with two different churches was something when he turned Quaker in the Tower of London began to be the basis of what he called his holy experiment, where everyone had the golden rule applied to his thinking in his city called Philadelphia. Everyone had the right to worship according to the dictates of his own conscience. These ideas were not known in Calvin's Geneva, but the beginning of recognizing a need for diversity was seen because various expressions of Reformed theology were permitted and attempts to allow them to exercise their conscience were worked out. And so that was the first steps of religious liberty in the city of Geneva. So the site of Servetus's burning at the stake is the black eye of Calvin's Reformation.
The history of the Reformed faith since it was established here in Geneva and other places is both glorious and tragic, I think. I mean, the example I often use is the way, it was Calvinists who established the justification for apartheid in South Africa and all the suffering that brought. And yet it was also Calvinists through the World Alliance of Reformed Churches who brought the theology with which to question that and to assess that. And I think we see that in so many areas that the Reformed faith can certainly lead us off in different directions, not all of which are glorifying to God by any means.
It's hard not to look back with tears at what we have done in the history of slavery, or not done. The way that sometimes horrible atrocities were even justified on biblical grounds by Reformed people.
I think at times there has tended to be a harshness. I don't think that's endemic to Calvinism if you take the whole Word of God, but there's often been a harshness against those that look at things in a different way.
The Calvinistic Presbyterian churches have often divided over issues of doctrine which are more about precision of explanation than the heart behind them. And I think our mistake has often been to divide mind and heart, to be concerned more about proposition than relationship, rather than to say these things must always be put together. And we say it, it's the peace and purity of the church, it's the unity of fellowship as well as the right doctrine of the body of believers that have to be maintained. But Presbyterians and Reformed people in particular have often leaned more on the doctrine than they have upon the heart of God behind that.
I think that certainly there have been mistakes along the way, but I think it's been self-correcting. It's part of that whole Semper Reformanda. The church has reformed itself over time. It's one of the great strengths is that it's corrected itself. For example, when some Reformed people supported slavery, I think that was self-correcting. It has righted the ship even when it's gotten off course. So certainly every tradition makes its errors. The question is, does it learn from its errors? Does it repent of its errors? Does it correct itself and get back on the right track? And I think that the Reformed tradition has done that.
As long as we're coming back to the Scriptures, we have this basis with which to question ourselves, to question one another, and hopefully to show up the mistakes that we make.
The Reformation, of course, was an imperfect movement. Religious liberty is one of those areas. But even though Calvin was not on the highest level of religious liberty by our standards today, for example, the Servetus affair, nevertheless, the beginnings of understanding that the church must have the freedom to be the church and not be under the power of the state is a foundational idea that he was well developing and that continued to develop for years to come. And so in a real sense, Calvin is the father of a religious liberty movement.
John Calvin never presented himself as somebody who was the full demonstration of what a Christian ought to be, but he was striving for that. And we should strive for that today, and I think we honor his legacy when we have a deep understanding of our own depravity. Calvin was very strong on that. But then recognizing the grace that God has given to us in Christ.